The guiding question for this series of podcasts and webinars is, how do we, as an educated, focused society, ensure the overall well-being of students and staff? If we're serious about the role that we're playing in preparing our students for their futures, as educators, we need to understand the factors needed to be emotionally healthy teachers so that all of our students will be able to learn. We thought a good place to start is with our brain, what happens in our brain. Horacio Sanchez is a highly sought after speaker and educational consultant who helps educators apply neuroscience to improve educational outcomes. He is recognized as one of the nation's prominent experts in how applying neuroscience promotes resiliency. As a former educator himself, an administrator, he speaks our language, which is why we love having him. And he engages all modalities needed for learning. Check out his many videos, his books that he's published, um, The Education Revolution, published by Corwin. He's also a Corwin author, and The Poverty Problem. And then his third book, or a third book, is A Brain-Based Approach to Closing the Achievement Gap. And that is published by Ex Libris Publishers. Please welcome Mr. Horacio Sanchez. Horacio, thank you.
Thank you. Can we ask all our participants to mute themselves because we get some feedback if they're not muted? Okay, we're going to talk about the poverty problem today, and the title of the rest of the webinar was given by someone else, and I'll explain why the title is misleading. So let's talk about what poverty does to the brain. Early on, what researchers were trying to do about 20 years ago was start a mapping of the brain to see, can we code the development of most brains and kind of predict at what rate infant brains were developing. 10 years into that project, they started noticing an anomaly in America, at least. And the anomaly was this: by age 2, there was a significant portion of the populations whose brain development were significantly different than the other kids in the study. When they tracked those kids, they found out that most of those kids were coming from poverty. So they started to think poverty is having an impact on the development of the brain. So people like Wolf and Noble started looking at this issue more closely. And one of the things in Noble's study was they looked at kids from all different economic backgrounds, and they basically measured their brain activity. And if you take a child and you bring them into a brand new stimulating environment, and you hook up electroencephalograms, which measures brain waves or electrical activities, you can see what areas of the brain are having the most activity, and you can measure the amount of activity. A baby in a stimulating environment usually shows you a level of beta or gamma, which means high activity, which means high focus, high learning, high retention. But there were kids in the study that were showing delta, which you're supposed to be showing when you're sleeping, and other kids showing theta, which is kind of like your brain is wandering. And they consistently found that the kids who had excessively low oscillation came out of poverty. So one of the things we now know pretty clearly is that most students coming from poverty, in America at least, have issues with focus. As a result, we need to consider building focus if we're going to work with kids who come from poverty. Because if we're not going to build focus, we're going to spend a lot of time doing what? Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And if you want to do that dance, you can do it, but it's painful. So there are ways you can build focus. Lots of schools, we go in there and we show them that you can do very small activities, like 60-second focus activities, beginning classes, and that over time helps kids improve their focus. And once kids can focus, they can attend better. Once they attend better, they understand more. Once they understand more, they perform better. Once you start performing better, you get dopamine, and dopamine reinforces the desire to perform better, and you have a self-motivated student. Certain things you can do. We use cognitive training activities, but you can also use mindfulness activities. A lot of mindfulness activities have been proven to improve focus. Our cognitive training stuff, we basically take games that we know improve focus and we made them electronic, and we just had kids do the games in 60-second focus drills. And it was almost like a competitive kind of thing. And they had to really focus to be able to answer the question at the end. And that's cognitive training. Lots of cognitive training now has been validated. You can probably go out and find good cognitive training so you don't have to invent the wheel yourself. And I would be remiss if I didn't say an aspect of focus has to do with how your body is actually doing. You cannot maintain good levels of focus if you don't get enough sleep. Your focus is also hampered if you eat poorly. And there seems to be an increase in focus capacity if you develop a lifestyle that has a lot of good exercise activity on a regular basis. So in many ways, lifestyle is your foundation of focus, and then it's how well you train your brain. So rather than fighting with the kids from the very beginning, we should almost assume that kids who are coming from poverty will have some issues in focus. So let's train it rather than fight with it. Any comments or questions at this moment?
So I have a comment kind of question.
Okay.
And it seems to me that at the very start, whether I'm in elementary, middle school, or high school, I need to stop with those moments to get kids to kind of help them retrain their brains.
Okay.
And then, go ahead.
After every transition,
After every transition,
when the brain makes a transition, it actually has to recalibrate. People who are very healthy and very well balanced, that means homeostasis, their brains recalibrate very quickly. People who don't have good homeostasis, their brain recalibrates slower. So it's also your setting impacts that also. In schools where they have a very more orderly and predictable transition into class, most kids recalibrate and their prefrontal cortex is more engaged in about 60 to 120 seconds. In schools that kids struggle with transitions and transitions tend to be less organized, it can take the brain up to 10 minutes to recalibrate. Now think about that. If teachers sometimes can be losing 10 minutes per period for every class day. Do that in the course of a year, you lose a lot of instructional time if your settings are not predictable and your transitions are poor. But kids who struggle with focus tend to take longer to recalibrate after a transition.
Horatio,
I'm sorry. We do have a question from Bernadette Baker too. So Jeff, if you want to put your thought in, and then we can go to Bernadette.
Horatio, a lot of schools have eliminated or truncated recess. Can you talk about the impact of recess and free play for kids?
That would be a whole other thing. I can tell you safely that play is natural to the brain. That's how kids learn at the beginning. The reduction of play has actually hindered brain development, and we actually forced onto kids at more earlier age for them to demonstrate a higher level of self-regulation. But the level of self-regulation that we're trying to do at preschool levels now and kindergarten tends to be not age appropriate. And a lot of things that we're teaching kids in a sitting setting, they could learn through play. So play is a more natural way of early learning, and it's a way that our kids can actually be more engaged and actually develop their learning faster. So we've actually hindered ourselves by moving away from play. And lots of states are going back to legislating play back into school. So yes, recess and play gives that brain a wonderful opportunity to recalibrate or to learn. Now,
Bernadette had one question, and then we'll move on to the next section.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
yes.
Oh, perfect. I'm so happy that your research has brought about this information because I've worked as a support worker contracted by the schools. And what I've been noticing is that a lot of the students who have been labeled as either potentially attention deficit disorder or ADHD or some kind of deficiency, that somehow they are too rambunctious, they're too disorderly, and it often these negative labels really it just makes it very hard for the student to um, to to progress in a more positive way. So yes, the issue is around how to enhance the physical development to get that energy out. Because I've often found that when I'm doing the support work with the students, I would go out into the playground, say, okay, you know what, we're going to run this off, or we're going to do something active. And then it helps them get that energy out to be able to go back into the classroom to then be able to have a little more focus on what they need to do. So I guess my question here would be, how can the labels be prevented so that students aren't being wrongly labeled as too rambunctious when really they need more to get the energy out in order to sustain their attention a little bit longer? Thank you.
I think that's too broad a question to handle at this moment, because there's too many things at risk here. And let me just taking ADHD. The occurrence of ADHD has blossomed, and one of the reasons it's blossoming is because of multitasking with technologies reduced the ability of people to focus. So a lot of healthier kids have what we call ADHD brain structures because of how we interact with technology. So the occurrence is increasing. Mislabeling of students, and that's something probably for a better day. I can't do that in a short soundbite, so I'm sorry. Let's table that for now, and let's get back to the topic. I'm sorry. The next thing you're going to know, if you're working with kids from poverty, one of the things we have to assume is that they're going to have issues with memory. And why am I going to say that? If you look at Blair's work, Blair looked at a huge sample of kids between ages of 1 to 2. So from birth to 2, he looked at these kids and went back at 3 separate points and took saliva readings for cortisol, and consistently found that kids in poverty, even in structured, safe environments, but from poverty, consistently showed elevated cortisol, usually starting at 7 months and maintaining it throughout. So we now have actually found out that many kids just being born into poverty seems to elevate the issues of cortisol, stress. The problem with that is stress hinders the development of the prefrontal cortex, and it really shrinks the hippocampus. The hippocampus is where it's in charge of initial learning. And if you cannot get information into the hippocampus for short term, you have no chance of developing long term. So we've gotten to the point where we now know if we look at kids from poverty, we find a shrinking of the hippocampus and lower connection, white matter, between the hippocampus to the prefrontal cortex, which is the developing of the actual communication system that develops long-term memory. So we should almost assume that we need to actually improve memory skills. In the old days, teachers used to actually teach memorization strategies to kids and practice them in classrooms. We've stopped doing that because somewhere along the line, someone said, hey, this is rogue, this is lower kinds of learning. We shouldn't be doing this in schools anymore. That is completely erroneous, because unless information is automated, you cannot build on it to make it actually have a higher level of comprehension. So the foundation of learning is automation. That means the ability to bring back things quicker enhances the ability to develop higher level thinking. So we had to improve memory, especially of kids coming from poverty. We know we can do that. If you look at Klingberg's work, you look at 50,000 kids, they did activities for 5 weeks, short memory activities, and there were a pre-scan and a post-scan, and in 5 weeks, they increased the memory capacity 15 to 20%, and we saw a pretty dramatic increase in gray matter in the hippocampus and the connection of the hippocampus to the prefrontal cortex, the ability to develop long-term memory. So now, if you're working with kids from poverty, you're going to think about improving focus, improving memory. The next thing we also know is that poverty is going to challenge the prefrontal cortex. It's going to reduce gray matter. And now understand, America decided to do a poverty line based on emergency food plans. That's the truth. So at that time, the Department of Agriculture made an emergency food plan right after the Great Depression. And what happened was there was an assumption that Americans spend 1/3 of their income on food. So they took the emergency food plan, multiplied it by 3, and that's how you got your poverty line. Every developed country in the world criticizes America for having the worst concept of what a poverty line is. So we really don't have a poverty line. We have a destitution line. And we've seen kids right above the poverty line consistently show less gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. What does gray matter mean? Gray matter is indicative of a region of the brain and how well it functions. So in certain key regions, their development requires enough gray matter for it to function appropriately. Kids above the poverty line, right above 4 to 6% drop in gray matter. Right under the poverty line, the drop is significant, 8 to 10% gray matter. And every drop after that impacts gray matter more. So the more destitute people are, the greater impact on the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, my friend, is the most critical part of the brain. It is the most evolved part of the brain. It is the thing that determines self-regulation. Self-regulation is your predictor of success. You drop gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, you lose the ability to control your thoughts, your actions, your behavior. So it's far more than the drop in standardized tests. We're burying the lead. It is a drop in the ability to control yourself. So one of the things you're also going to do if you're going to work with kids from poverty, you're going to have to improve emotional control. There are lots of ways you can improve emotional control. And by the way, you've just done it. If you've improved focus, you've improved gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, and you're helping them out. If you improve memory, we found out that if you improve kids' memories, gray matter increases in the prefrontal cortex and in the hippocampus. But here's a program that was validated by Brody and proven to improve self-regulation and develop the prefrontal cortex. And it has 2 components for teachers and 2 components for students. The first one was the adults had to be nurturing in relation to the students. Nurturing here isn't poor baby, poor baby. Nurturing here is seeing when students are struggling emotionally and helping them identify what they're feeling and labeling. That was a key. What emotions am I feeling and how to label it? Secondly, the adults also had to engage in what was called effective discipline, not reactive discipline. Reactive discipline is I do something and you respond. That's a discipline, emergency discipline plan. Every school has that. Effective discipline says, I think about the skills you need to do well at school, and we develop those social skills or behavioral skills on a regular basis where I practice them and put them into my repertoire, and having those skill sets helps me function better at school. For the student, we had to get the student to actually develop future orientation. And you say future orientation? Apparently poverty lowers future orientation. 2 reasons. One reason we now know is When you shrink the hippocampus, if the hippocampus shrinks, your ability to picture yourself in the future goes down. When you stop picturing yourself in the future, you stop planning. That is the first thing. The second thing we know about poverty, it seems to exacerbate the amygdala and also reduce its size. So people whose amygdalas are challenged tend to be more emotionally unstable and reactive. And so you have people who are more reactive and less planning for the future. We found out you had to actually get students on a regular basis, yes, as early as elementary school, to start saying out loud what they're going to be in the future. It doesn't matter if they change it every other day. It doesn't matter. They have to say what they're going to be. And then our job has to be to help them see what they're learning today, how it correlates to what they want to do tomorrow. That is a key step because we need for them to understand that learning is valuable to what they want to achieve. That is key for the folks from coming from poverty, because there seems to be a disconnect with the value of learning and outcomes. And then fourth, you had to get the students to develop skill sets of how do I cope when I'm stressed? Because we found out that oftentimes kids who are from poverty don't deal with stress well. But there seems to be a key here that was important. You had to make the strategies normative. Here's the problem. Kids who lack emotional control, we go to them like they're weird and we say, you're struggling with your control. We're going to teach you some skill sets so you can control your behavior. And you're telling them you're going to control your behavior because you lack the capacity to do that, and they're going to reject the technique. Here's what we found out. If we just polled kids in a classroom, say, hey, what do you guys do when you're stressed? Kids will give you responses and you'll hear things like, oh, I exercise. Oh, I play, or I read, I meditate. And everybody gives you ideas. And you say, okay, all those strategies are good. And here's the reason why. Your brain is a one-track brain. Once you start thinking about stuff, you keep on thinking about it till you change the track. One of the ways we humans cope with stress is do something else so our brain goes off the stress track. And if we do something that we enjoy or is positive, it improves our chemistry and we feel less stressed. Then we tell the students, well, a lot of those things you can't do necessarily if you feel stressed in a classroom. So here are some techniques that we can do in practice to reduce stress while we're in a classroom. And we teach it school-wide. And rather than saying, hey, only some people need to know this, we teach it across the board. And if you can get these 4 steps into your school, we found out that self-regulation in the students actually improves. And even more importantly, we found changes to the structure of the prefrontal cortex, helping students gain better control. So to summarize, we now know there are 3 things you're going to do if you're working with kids from poverty. Work on their focus, work on their memory, and work on their self-control. Before we transition to the second half, do we have a couple questions we can actually respond to?
Please feel free to put anything in the chat. We just want to make sure that we are keeping an eye on the time. We can also put questions in there. It looks like we've got one from Andrew. In terms of improving memory, how do we create a healthier balance when focusing on strengthening students' memories, not just for rote memorization of facts for the purpose of test taking, but for longer term benefits of critical thinking, problem solving, et cetera?
Well, if you think about it, like in the natural world, most of us started training our brains for memory when we were very young, and we did it playing games. And many of us can even remember playing games that we competed in that improved our memory. Those early game experiences were foundational for memory capacity later on. And as a result, when we actually train memory, we oftentimes do it in very small chunks of some form of game playing that happens very quickly in an electronic device on the screen. and the kids focus and they try to remember certain things, and we just do 60 seconds at a time. We're not telling you go back to a lot of rote memorization. What we're saying is the skill set has been neglected enough that so many kids are struggling with memory. And when we looked at kids from poverty, what we found was this: when we hooked them up to fMRI and they were trying to remember things, their brain was working so hard it caused irritation, and then they quit. And once the brain does that a few times, the brain gives up on trying to bring information back. So we just want to get brains that are better able to recall information, and we can train it in a very short amount of time.
Thank you, Andrew, for that question and for the response, Horacio. We have one from Spencer. Could you share the practice you mentioned that you did school-wide to train students to deal with stress?
What we basically did was we showed them that there are 3 different approaches to this kind of stuff. There is physical response. That physical response says, if I can actually hold my body in a place where I have to focus on holding my body in a position, my stress level will actually go down. That's why they found out certain yoga poses reduces stress. That's because your brain is focusing so hard in holding position, you actually regulate your stress levels. There's a lot of research that's gone into how your breath impacts cortisol. So we actually showed students that their breathing will reduce their cortisol levels, and we could show it in a pretty easy stress test piece. We could take a reading of their pressure, and then we had them do breathing, and they could actually see the pressure go down. So once students understood how important breath was, that was another way where they actually were able to improve their ability to control their stress. So we showed them a very strong physical capacity, which is more overt that they can do any place else outside of school. And we showed them a breathing technique that they used within the classrooms when they were stressed. Then we also showed them mental shift. And mental shift is really easy. We say have 3 thoughts or places that make you, things you think about that make you feel better, and train yourself when you get stressed to think on those things and spend 60 seconds just focusing on those things. And you have 3 things that you always make you feel good: a memory, a place, a location, whatever. You focus on those things for 60 seconds and you usually can shift your brain and then go back.
Great, thank you. That was the end of the questions. We just had a couple recommendations. People use some different strategies like songs and memorizing the timetable. So just kind of very specific things that they've used that they have shown have worked. So not so much a question, just some personal experience.
Cool. Now, there's a second layer to this issue of poverty, and it has to do with America. In America, we have a country where poverty has been so associated to someone's race that it's correlated tightly. Let me explain. In one of the largest longitudinal poverty studies ever done, they tracked people in America, and they found that the chances of a white child experiencing poverty was less than 1/4 of the population. However, 2/3 of Black children are likely to experience poverty. Of that 2/3, they are 20% more likely to experience what is called concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty says the issues related to poverty are exacerbated and are more pronounced to the point where they become so commonplace that it changes how people think and act on a more dramatic level. As late as the last 2017 data census says, if you were Black or Hispanic of color, you are twice as likely to be poor in America. Why is this a big issue? Because of how our brain works. Any disproportionate pattern in our society tends to create a bias. The brain says, I see this so often, I will just make it a shortcut. And so poverty, Black, poverty, Black, poverty, Black. Then when I see someone who is Black my brain will subconsciously think poverty. Subconscious means you're not aware you're doing it, but it will still influence your thoughts and actions. I'll explain that a little clearer later on. We now know, based on a lot of research, that when people in America think of poverty, there's a lot of behaviors they assume. These are the most prevalent. Subconsciously, when you think of poor people, you think poor academic performance, bad decision-making, lack of emotional control, and high risk-taking behaviors. Well, what's the problem with the bias there? That means if I see someone of color and my subconscious brain thinks poor, I will therefore put upon these folks these behaviors at a subconscious level. This starts to explain what we saw. So if you take the Yale study takes teachers, random elementary school teachers, and brings them in to work with a wide group of kids, and it's tracking their behaviors in their brains. They're wearing these glasses, and the glasses are designed to track what is called microsarcades. Microsarcades are a constant scanning feature of your eyes. Microsarcades work all the time with your subconscious brain to monitor your environment for things that can hurt you, things that you believe. Those things become prevalent for your microsarcades. So if I have a subconscious belief, my microsarcades will be looking for it. So when these teachers come in, their eye tracking movement showed clearly that the percentage of microsarcade monitoring of Black students was significantly higher than all the other students. So teachers subconsciously watched Black students more. That's because we believe that they had a subconscious association of the expectation of negative behaviors. Here's the problem, how it comes up in real time. I'm unaware that I'm monitoring these students more. But since I am monitoring them more, when they do something, I am more likely to catch them. So I catch them, I catch them, I catch them. But then there are other times when other students are doing the same things and I miss them. The students start to think, gee, the teacher is out to get me. If the student lacks emotional control, oftentimes that perception exacerbates their behavior and it intensifies. And now you have this self-fulfilling prophecy of the student acting out more, which causes the microsarcades to even monitor even more, and it becomes worse. This starts to explain the occurrence of data that's disproportional that can only be explained with these kinds of biases. For example, preschool in America, Blacks represent 19% of all preschool. Black males represent almost 6% of preschool. Black males make up almost 47% of suspensions in preschool. Wow, 6% of the population making up 47%. Now that brings us to a big question. This seminar put racism in the title. I would have never done that because what we're talking about here isn't racism. What we're talking here is implicit bias. Implicit bias and racism work nothing alike. Implicit bias says, I can develop a bias that's against my values and beliefs because of where I live or patterns I see. Let me give you a concrete example. When your brain listens to someone talk, the first thing your brain monitors for is tonality. Is there any emotion in what someone's saying? In milliseconds, in the first 150 milliseconds of speech, the first thing your brain is monitoring is emotion. If the emotion is positive, the amygdala will assign it a positive chemical signature, and you already start to feel a little bit better. If the emotion is negative, the amygdala assigns it a negative chemical signature, and the feeling is immediately a little worse. By 300 milliseconds, now there are 1,000 milliseconds and 1 second. By 300 milliseconds, your brain does what is called identifiers. You identify who's talking, their race, their age, their level of intelligence. You all these things, milliseconds. You don't start to actually analyze words till 600 milliseconds or later. So your subconscious brain, without you being aware, already has an emotional feeling and already thinks about who's talking. Now, if your emotion was negative and your thoughts about who's talking was negative, would that influence how you interpret the words? Yes, that is called bias. So bias has occurred what? Before you have a chance to formulate a conscious response. So if you think about any disproportionate pattern in our environment, it works the same way. If I associate a group of people to poverty, and I assume subconsciously that they are going to promote those behaviors, the minute that happens, my microsarcades goes, well, they're likely going to do something. I can't control my microsarcades. My microsarcades will monitor those kids more closely. Once I monitor them more closely, I will see more behaviors. Once I have a subconscious belief, my brain has what is called a confirmation bias. A confirmation bias says, I will see things in the environment that confirm that belief without ever trying, and I will miss contradictions in the environment without ever trying. So a lot of what we see when it comes to data that is disproportionate, like the extreme things you just saw with elementary, has far more to do with implicit bias, because it says most of us do it unintentionally without even knowing that we're doing it. It is subconscious. And to show you how subconscious it is, Yale found out it didn't matter if the teacher was male or female, black or white. We all live the society which has promoted this association. And as a result, even if we don't value it, we subconsciously think it. We put the two things together, and we all monitored those students a little bit more closely because the pattern is so prevalent in our society. And the brain says, anytime there's a disproportionate pattern, let's put the two things together. So what can we do about it? We found out that subconscious biases come out subtly in your subconscious beliefs. So what happens if I see a group of kids, a small subset of kids underperforming in my school, and I look at the data every 2 weeks, and every 2 weeks they're still underperforming. After 2 months, they're still underperforming. Half year, they're still underperforming. At the end of the year, they're still underperforming. Next year, I get another group of kids, same subgroup, they are underperforming. In a short amount of time, my brain's going to go, shortcut. I see these subgroup of kids, I think underperformance. I see these subgroups, I think underperformance. However, consciously, I work with these kids. I love these kids. I'm an advocate for these kids. However, my brain can still develop a bias. So once it has the bias, what would it influence? It influences what I believe. So when I see those kids, I will subconsciously think they will underperform. That will subtly come out some ways in my behaviors. And the places that my brain will take over when I have a belief first is my face, my hands, my posture, my gesture, my tone of voice. And it will be subtle. But you see, they have microsarcades too. And their microsarcades pick up these subtle hints that you have a certain belief, and it will give them a feeling, and they will respond subconsciously without knowing that they're responding the way they are, and it will exacerbate. So in many ways, we dance with everyone we encounter, and our subconscious brain has an immediate response, and it kind of influences our conscious brain. And we subtly do things that we don't think we're doing. And that is the biggest explanation we know, because the numbers are pretty clear. Most people demonstrate a bias towards this minority population with an assumption of certain things. And here's the shocking thing. It doesn't matter who you are, because if you live in a society that creates a bias pattern, it's hard not to develop the bias. And once the bias is there, your brain will influence you beforehand. So what are things you can do? You can be more conscientious and controlling better your face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice when interacting with kids who are different. And why different? Because different triggers our amygdala, and oftentimes that's the places where subtle cues come out. You say, well, that's just you phoning up and trying to do this stuff. It's not going to change the subconscious brain stuff. Actually, we found that it does. If I work hard on changing my presentation when I'm meeting people who are not like me, the brain will retyrate to actually having a more positive feeling for them. And we see the amygdala's reaction to people who are different go down, and now it becomes a natural response. But the only way I will work on that is if I accept that subconsciously, I oftentimes project things that I don't intend to project when I deal with people who are different than me. That's step one. And it's a perfect step to start, because if you can do better as one individual and everyone takes on that approach, suddenly the environment gets better and people start to feel better about themselves and what they can achieve. And it's a good place to start. And when we've gotten schools to think about that as their first step in dealing with implicit bias, teachers have written us and told us all the things that have changed because they've been more conscious in controlling face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice when dealing with anyone who's considered out group. It's a good time to take some questions.
All right, I know you've mentioned the amygdala. Randy is wondering if there are any other parts of the brain involved with the development of implicit racial bias.
There's a system, okay? The bias system first starts with your eyes. Your system starts like this. Mirror neurons immediately start to mirror any emotions you see. So when we see emotions, that's why we have a feeling. Mirror neurons activate, they trigger motor neurons. The motor neurons trigger your brain like you're actually doing the expression you're seeing someone else is doing. And that's why we feel things when we see people who are pissed off. And that's why it gives us a negative feeling. And people who are happy gives us more happy feeling, because guess what we're doing? Our motor neurons are smiling when we're seeing someone smiling, which is making us feel better. Once the motor neurons activate, the amygdala, the emotional brain, gives that a chemical signature. That's where you get your emotion, your feeling. Then your insula actually in milliseconds calibrates and thinks about all the times it's seen that kind of emotion in different settings to give us a social context. And then we have what is called social understanding. We know how critical this is because kids with autism have what? Inoperative mirror neurons. So you can tell them what someone is feeling or what an emotion is, but they don't empathize the same way, because when they see someone smiling, they're not automatically smiling in their brains. That's why we started to tell kids with autism to actually do the emotion in response. They smile, you smile, and then you can understand smiling better. This is where we get empathy from. So your insula gives you the social context, and this all happens in milliseconds. So that is called the empathy and the bias system. By the way, it's the same side of two sides of the same coin. Empathy and bias work on the same exact system.
Thank you, Horacio. One more question. Do you think this bias is causing disproportionality in special education placement and or more rigorous discipline towards children of color?
Yeah, there's been so much work on that. It's clear as day. If you look at the data nationwide, one of the things we know is there's a disproportionate issues with discipline, disproportionate issues with academic performance. To show you how bad it is, if you took at the Office of Civil Rights Complaints for minorities who are fluent and middle class, 80% of them have to do with the folks believing that their child was being treated like they were going to do these behaviors, even though it wasn't even part of their repertoire. So the amount of placement in special education is disproportionate. It's also disproportionate in suspensions. We've done system study. We've done national studies on the same thing, and we identify disproportionality in special education, discipline data, advanced placements, and in also grading systems. A lot of subconscious bias influences grading pretty dramatically.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Not at this time.
Okay, let's get our host here, and we will have a further discussion with our hosts.
So Horatio, thank you so much for being with us today. And one of the things that came to mind as I was listening to you is just from my work too, I find that when we talk to teachers about these things, they start to understand more about the brain and what's happening to the brains of children who've been marginalized or who live in poverty. Then their empathy sometimes starts to increase right at that moment. However, as you said, we need some work with practice, right? So is there some structure we can set up in schools, really, so it's a little more systematic as we work with teachers?
I found out that what we've been doing wrong is we keep on focusing on the outcome backwards, and that's what's causing a problem. If I were to, I don't want to be a person who goes to a bunch of preschool teachers and tell them they have bias, because it's going to be hard for them to know that, because they love the kids and they think they're caring for the kids. And many of them are advocates for the kids that they have a bias against. But when we start with telling them how the brain produces bias, they get to understand it so much more. And most of us are not aware. If I took a poll of these folks who are in the audience today and say to them, are you aware that you lose control of your face, your hands, your posture, your gestures in times throughout a day that you have no awareness of? It's just that the brain will take over those things and give out subtle signals that you're unaware of. Most people will tell you no, because you're unaware of it. It's subconscious. But once people understand what the brain does and how it starts, they're going, okay, then I accept that, and now I'm willing to do stuff about it. And yes, the moment you say, I am going to spend more time focusing on what my face, hands, posture, and gestures, a tone of voice when I meet anyone who's different than me, and that should be the easiest rule, anyone who's different than me. Once you do that, and you do that for a little bit of time, you start to actually see the difference. You go like, oh crap, the world is becoming a nicer place. People are responding to me differently. The world is changing. And that's the experience I had. And it's just like every quality of interaction dramatically improved, because I went out of my way to really focus whenever I dealt with out-group members in controlling my face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice. The world hadn't changed. What changed is people's brains' reaction to me. And that's the first level of bias that we teach people, the face. We also make sure they understand that when you're born with 3 other biases that influence you dramatically. You're born with negative bias, because it's supposed to keep you alive. So we weigh things that are negative more than positive. And anybody who's in a school knows that, because try making a change in the school and people, So we have a negative bias. So we have to work on being more positive. We have what is called a confirmation bias. That means our microsarcades will spot things that strengthen our belief, and we will miss things that we don't believe. So what is the converse to that? The converse to that is this. If I have kids who are struggling, I need to actually be on the lookout for positive things that I can reinforce with them, because I'm more likely to miss it. And the third thing is we have this thing called impact bias, and we're the only creature on the face of the earth that can do this. If this were to happen, then these following things could possibly happen. So we create scenarios all the time, and the scenarios oftentimes are overblown, and we are sucky at ever identifying when our predictions were wrong, which they usually are.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening with impact bias is when we see students struggling, our subconscious brain automatically starts to create scenarios that dooms them without us even knowing. We start to think they're failing in this, they're going to be failing this, and our brain is doing this without us knowing it. And we are thinking the worst scenario possible. And that happens subconsciously. And that's why things like expectations go down. So therefore, now I have to start to say, okay, I need to retrain my expectations for struggling populations because I know my subconscious brain is battling. I tell people all the time, the subconscious brain is where it's at. It has always influenced your conscious brain. You're thinking your conscious brain is here and this is what you're doing, you're a rational, logical creature. Before you had a chance to formulate a conscious thought, the subconscious brain has influenced you. And the subconscious brain has influenced you because of these three biases, but then your environment. Any disproportionate pattern in your environment creates subconscious bias. So look at your environment. I tell teachers, what do you see? Is there a pattern? If you have poor performing subgroup, guess what? Chances there's a bias. If you have a high performing subgroup, chances they're biased. So you have to start understanding these things because if you do, you start to tell yourself where you're likely to make a mistake or do things that you don't intend to do. And then we start trying to fight those things. And that's why we have to start thinking. We have to start trying to think more positive for people who are different. We have to start having better expectations. We have to start to look for things that are positive because our brain's going to already look for the things that are negative. And we start to recalibrate ourselves so we can overcome the bias that we're fighting all the time. And I think that becomes an essential part of the message. And I started first with face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice. And then I moved on to negative, confirmation, and impact. And those are foundational things that we also start to work on because we all know it's there. And you don't need to be a neuroscience to know you have a negative bias. you don't need that. Most people can look out on the social media and you can see negative bias. You can see confirmation bias, and confirmation bias is killing us right now. Because people are just hanging around with the people who are saying the things that they believe, and so we need to start to understand how our brain is working, and it's all happening, and we understand our brains better at the beginning. We can start to really be proactive in dealing with these things. But what we can't do is start at the back end and try to force people to believe that they are biased people contributing to the outcomes. They are. But they don't know that, and they have to help them understand why. And it's not that they're biased people contributing to the outcome. It is that we are biased people contributing to the outcome. All of us are doing it.
So Horacio, thank you so much. We will get back to you in just a minute. So it's time for